Thank you for attending our webinar today. I'd like to introduce to you the presenter, Dr. Nelson Marquina. Dr. Marquina's expertise is built on a foundation of many areas of science: biophysics, engineering, statistics, neurology, physiology, and biochemistry. He started USA Laser with other physicians and engineers to maximize the potential of laser therapy in pain relief and tissue healing. He has gained international recognition for his knowledge in the field and his ability to integrate different sciences, technologies, and perspectives. Let us begin. Dr. Nelson Marquina.
Thank you for the introduction. This particular webinar, we're going to be focusing on laser therapy, the safety and regulations, both state level and federal level by the FDA in particular. So let's see what we will cover for this webinar. We're going to start with a brief review of laser therapy. I'm sure most of you have been using lasers or been reading about lasers, but at least maybe to have a common background, to have a brief review, so we have at least the same language and same jargon, so we can communicate properly. Right after that, we're going to get into the laser classification, and again, from the point of view of laser therapy. Then we're going to look at what are the factors or potential causes of tissue damage with the lasers and explore why that is the case. After that, we're going to get into the laser safety goggles and how to read the ratings. If you go to a website or something, you may want to purchase perhaps safety goggles for your particular laser. Then I'll give you the information on how you can read the rating system and understand what you're buying. After that, we're going to look into the question of how much laser energy is too much. And this question is a little bit loaded. We will come back to on this the way it is phrased. I hear this a lot from doctors and customers and laser people who are using the laser elsewhere. Question about the amount of laser energy. And I'll describe to you why this is the incorrect question. And we will get into details on that. But just to kind of, again, it's a tricky question. It's a trick question in a sense. And we're going to finish the webinar by looking at the FDA and state regulations, the difference between them and what to look for in terms of making sure that you meet your state requirements and the FDA requirements. So let's get started with a brief review of laser therapy right now. And as we all know, a photon is just an electromagnetic wave, and we're going to be focusing in particular about the wavelength, the distance from peak to peak on this particular wave. We will see that the importance, extreme high importance of wavelength when it comes to safety, and not just the clinical effect, the benefits of that. Different wavelengths have different effects, but also from the safety perspective, you will see a difference based on the wavelength. And let's not forget that the purpose of laser therapy is to penetrate the laser into tissues, but without causing damage. So here it shows my hand, and you can see the infrared beam going right through my hand. And you may say, but if it is infrared, it's not visible. So how come we can see a white light? Yeah, that's because I use an infrared camera to convert the infrared laser beam into a white light, so we as humans can see it. So this is an infrared photograph. So to get into this tissue penetration, let me just introduce really briefly the World Association for Laser Therapy, or the WALT. You see the website at the bottom. The WALT on tissue penetration says the factors affecting the laser depth of tissue penetration. Number one, by far the most important one, the laser's wavelength. Second, whether the laser is superpulsed or not. We'll see why that is the case. The power output, of course, of the laser, and the technical design of the apparatus. What kind of spot size the handpiece has, the aperture of the laser, and the treatment technique used. From the laser therapy and safety in particular, we're going to be focusing on the first three bullets: the laser's wavelength, whether the laser is superpulsed or not, and the power output. So these are the recommendations from the World Association for Laser Therapy. To introduce the concept of wavelength, let me use this particular chart. So here we have continuous wave laser, CW, and let's suppose we have a 12-watt average power. So that would be on the vertical axis, and time is on the horizontal axis. Let's say 1 second just to have it easy to compute and all that. So this is a 12-watt CW laser, continuous wave. But this CW laser, like most CW lasers in the US, they may be turned on and off fast enough to simulate a pulsing. So that's what it means by, in this case, a CW pulsed laser. Means that the beam has been interrupted, like a switch. On, off, on, off, on, off. Of course, it's done electronically, so it's much faster. The point here is that the average power is no longer 12 watts, but in this case, this particular example would be 6 watts, just because the laser's on half of the time and off half of the time. So the duty cycle is 50%. Therefore, the average power would be half of that. So it would be, in this case, would be 6 watts. But notice that each pulse is still 12 watts, the peak power. And the average power now is 6. So the more you pulse it, the lower the average power, of course. It's just a straight math, really. Now, so let me contrast now a CW laser pulsed versus a superpulsed. So here is the same example. The CW peak power is 12 watts, and the average power of the CW is 6 watts. And we're going to use 1 second in this case. Notice that here we have 4 pulses per second. So that's why it's called 4 hertz. Hertz meaning pulses per second. So in the horizontal axis, I wrote CW pulse train of 4 hertz. Now let me contrast, overlay the superpulsed beams and see how it looked. In this case, the superpulse will look like this. The pulse duration on the time axis is very, very short and superpulsed. CWs tend to be more milliseconds, so thousandths of a second, where the superpulse tend to be in nanoseconds, so that's billionth of a second. So it's easily a factor of 1,000, or sometimes even 10,000, a factor of 10,000. So superpulse pulse durations are extremely, extremely short. And that's the reason why the superpulse can have high peak powers and, relatively speaking, low average power compared to CW. That's the reason why superpulse can penetrate fairly deep because of the peak power and cause no damage because the average power is low enough. So we'll get into more details about that in a moment. So we have 2 types of laser power, average and peak. Superpulsed laser can have peak powers of 50 watts, 60 watts, 100, 250 watts, and higher. With continuous wave lasers, the peak power typically in the US tend to be more like 10 watts, 15 watts, 20 watts, 30 watts, and there's one brand that has a 60 watt. Actually, there are 3 brands, 3 different names, but they're all made by the same company, same supplier. That's a 60 watt, that's the highest average power on CW lasers. But the point here, superpulse tends to be in the hundreds, 200, 250, 300 watts peak power. So we're going to distinguish the two between the peak power and the average power. Let's look at WALT. WALT, the World Association for Laser Therapy, what do they have to say on laser dose? Number 1, the most important factor is the dose. It's also called the energy density. We're going to be discussing that quite a bit, the dose. The dose is the number of joules divided by the size of the irradiated area in square centimeters. We call that the spot size, or SS. So that we're going to be using SS for spot size. And one more thing, as a reference, I want to introduce Dr. Tina Carew from Russia. Her last book is 10 Lectures in Basic Science of Laser Phototherapy. Let's see what she has to say about superpulse and CW lasers. What she states is cellular response to CW and CW pulsed and superpulse They're quite different. In fact, what she found in her research is that the dose needed for maximally possible stimulation were orders of magnitude less for superpulsed lasers as compared to the same doses for CW. So that's a significance that will affect how we use lasers and hence the risk also. What it means here is to have the same similar clinical effects on CW lasers, they have to have higher power. And higher power means higher risk also. So we're talking about powers, energies, and all that. What are these units of measurements? Well, the average power is in watts. Watts is like a speaker. Where we talk about a 100-watt speaker versus 10-watt speaker, so you know the difference. It's a form of intense sound. In this case, it would be sound, of course. But in case of light, that's photons per second. So the rate of emission is the amount, but the amount per unit of time. So it's a rate of emission. Quite different from energy. Energy is the total amount of energy, total amount of photons. So in this case, time comes into place. So the unit is joules, and joule is defined as 1 watt for 1 second. So let's look at that. For example, the 1 joule could be also half a watt for 2 seconds, or tenth of a watt for 10 seconds. So that's kind of the idea. Again, it's straight math in there. So you can see that the lower power can be compensated by increased time. So we end up with the same amount of energy. So average power is the rate of emission, is the amount of photons per second, per unit of time. The energy is the total amount of photons emitted during the treatment time. So the treatment time comes into place. So this is focused on average power. Let me come up with a little analogy using water. So imagine you have a garden hose, and you can see the amount of water coming out. So imagine it's X gallons per second. On the second case, we have higher gallons per second. So that's high power. As you can imagine, high volume. There's more stuff coming out of the hose. So that analogy in terms of water, we can call the water power is gallons per second. But similarly, we can say the laser power is photons per second. So that's kind of the idea, is the amount of stuff coming out. In the case of laser, of course, we're talking about photons. Those, like we showed before from the World Association for Laser Therapy, is the absolutely most important parameter. Let's see what it means. Before getting to that, we need to define what we mean by power density. Well, you can think of intensity. Power density is the average power divided by the size of the beam, the spot size. So it's the concentration of photons in a specific area. So that's what we mean by intensity. It's quotation marks because it's technically, from the academic side, it's not quite intensity, but for practical purposes, we can think of intensity. So the power density, because of this, is the power divided by the size of the spot size. The units would be watts per square centimeter. So that's power density. We're going to use the acronym PD for that. Energy density is power density times the treatment time in seconds. So because of that, the units obviously will be joules per square centimeter. That is the dose. This, again, notice that time comes into place only when we're talking about energy, not average power. Anytime we talk about energy, treatment time comes into place. Otherwise, it does not. So let's proceed with that. Let's look at the significance of this. Okay. So power density, or PD, is the average power divided by the spot size. And energy density, or ED, well, that would be the power density times the treatment time, which is the dose that we discussed before. Now let's look at this. And instead of PD, let me write the expression for PD, which is average power divided by the spot size. So notice where spot size shows up in there. So let's just focus on that. So let's notice a couple of things. That if the spot size gets larger, that will produce lower power density and lower dose. So that's one effect of the spot size. But notice also that because the average power is on the numerator of the dose, that means a larger average power will produce higher power density and higher dose. And one more point, notice that treatment time is also as a multiplier. So longer treatment time produces higher dose. Has nothing to do with average power. Treatment time affects energy only. So that's what shows up there. The last bullet says longer treatment time produces higher dose. Nothing to do with average power. Now let's look at graphically the effect of the spot size on dose. Let's suppose we have a target dose, say, which is very common, 5 joules per square centimeter. Usually the range is between about 4 joules per square centimeter to about 20 joules per square centimeter. That's the typical range in laser therapy. So let's suppose we have a handpiece, a spot size that produces that particular graphical size. And those are the three diodes in there. It's a fairly common configuration. In fact, there's one laser that has exactly that. Has a spot size, has 3 diodes of 30 milliwatts each. But let's suppose, again, focusing on those. We want to produce 5 joules per square centimeter on that. But if we have a larger handpiece for the same diodes and same power, we have to either have higher average power and or longer treatment time to compensate. So again, there's no free lunch. If you have a large spot size or a large handpiece, you either have higher average power or longer treatment time to accomplish the same dose. So that's all in the no free lunch here. It may look more impressive to have a big handpiece, but you have to have the delivery of the amount of laser coming out commensurate with the size. One more issue here to point out, by the way, I'm not dealing with safety, but look at the spacing between the diodes. You can have a large handpiece, but if the diodes are separated, in between the diodes, what's treating the tissue? Nothing. So that's kind of the downside of having these large handpieces with not enough diodes or not enough power. But that's a separate subject. Let's just this the spot sizes. So this is one for our products called the Lumix. Notice the handpiece, because the spot size is so important, we have the handpiece has a zoom lens, so we can adjust the spot size based on the clinical requirement. If we need higher intensity, we lower, we focus more. If we have a larger area with less intensity, we open up the aperture. It's like a camera. We have, you can adjust the aperture. And in this particular model, we have different tips on the handpiece. Point I'm trying to make here is that we have to be aware of the spot size based on the clinical requirement. What are we treating and why we're doing that kind of intensity? So the effect of spot size and treatment time on dose, let's see a graphical here to summarize. There's average power. Average power, if we add the spot size, that will give us power density. So there's average power, AP, and then take into account the spot size, then we get power density. But with power density, if we take into account treatment time, then we get the dose, the energy density. So this is kind of a summary of how we can visually get a feeling for how do we get to the dose. We have to start with the average power, not peak power, average power. And then we have to take into account the size of the aperture of the laser that you're using with to get an idea of the power density, and that will give you an idea what the treatment time would be. That would be based on the protocols to achieve a target dose. Let's move on to the classification of the lasers, why it's important. In fact, actually, from the laser therapy perspective, there's a we kind of make it a big deal out of it, but it shouldn't be. So let's get into details and clear the smoke. Too much misinformation out there. Laser classifications. There's one classification from the FDA And the CDRH is the agency that controls and regulates lasers. That stands for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. There's also the OSHA from the safety perspective, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC. IEC, like the name implies, is the international body that regulates not just lasers, but any form of electrotechnical, electromechanical equipment. There's a program called the Global Harmonization Program going on right now across all countries in the world, including the FDA, is to harmonize all these regulations across countries, so we don't have different rules and different classifications from different countries. So it's in process right now. It's getting very close. So I'm going to focus on the classification from the FDA, because that's the one that controls us today. Even though when you search for lasers and goggles and all that, you will run into the IEC acronym. From the laser goggle perspective, they're exactly the same. Don't worry about that. You can use IEC or the classification from the CDRH. There's some minor differences today between the two, so let's not worry about that. I want to focus on the FDA. So let's look at the FDA. So we have the FDA on the left column and the laser product hazard on the right. We start with class 1. Class 1 laser is doesn't do damage. Maybe if you go through an optical aid like a magnifying lens or something like that, because it concentrates the light even more. But otherwise, class 1 lasers do not require goggles at all, so that's non-hazardous. Class 2A and class 2, they could be cause a problem if you look at it for a long time. By long time means on a rule about 1,000 seconds. Okay, or optical aids, choose not class 1. Optical aids can concentrate more than your eye can handle. But class 2A and class 2 are okay unless you're there looking at it for a long time. Class 3A can be an issue, okay, but it's not a permanent damage. It can be an issue even if you're looking at it directly, pointing with the eye. A typical example would be a laser pointer. A laser pointer is a class 3A device. In fact, in the US, class 3A device like a laser pointer, the maximum power they can have is 5 milliwatts. So that's a laser pointer. Class 3B is okay to the eye, but only a quarter of a second because the power is higher. And the rule for class 3B is that they must have no more than half a watt of average power. And nothing to do with peak power. This is only average power. So it's maximum half a watt or a dose, an energy density of no more than 10 joules per square centimeter. So that's a class 3B. Class 4, which is the highest, is anything that is beyond that. So its exposure is higher than 3B. In particular, is the average power is more than half a watt. And that, based on this classification, the FDA will say, well, that can produce eye damage from exposure and also risk of fire. The downside, from the therapy perspective, if we're using, relatively speaking, low power lasers. 10 watts is a relatively low power. Okay, even 15 watts, 20 watts, they're not high. Compared to other lasers that can run in thousands of watts, some of them millions of watts. So class 4 is anything over half a watt, which makes it kind of impractical from the laser therapy perspective, because that class 4 covers from half a watt to thousands of watts or millions of watts. So it's kind of not quite so useful. Let me just point out here that class 1, 2A, 2, and class 3A, those lasers are so low power that from the laser therapy, from the clinical perspective, they're useless. For class 1, for example, class 1, in fact, if you look at it directly, doesn't do anything, doesn't do damage to the eye. What is it going to do clinically in terms of pain relief or tissue healing? Absolutely nothing. Even though there's one laser, very popular laser in the U.S., there's a class 1 laser. In fact, they turn it around. It says, doctor, our lasers are so good, you don't even need a safety laser goggles. So that's so practical about that. Well, what they're saying is that, there's so little juice, laser juice coming out, that's not going to do anything. But it is a very popular laser sold in the U.S. I'm not going to focus on those classes, 1, 2A, 2, and 3A, for the reasons I mentioned. I'm going to focus on 3B and class 4. What do they mean? Laser classification based on risk of eye damage, period. It has nothing to do with therapeutic effectiveness, even though it's so clear that the classification based on that, still from the marketing claims, you can see the statement class 4 laser therapy claimed by some laser companies and also doctors, using lasers. They advertise to patients, yes, we offer class 4 laser therapy, but that's meaningless. Class 4 is classification based on a risk to eye damage. Unless we're treating eyeballs, then it has nothing to do with therapy at all. So let's not do that. But it sounds good. Class 4 laser therapy, because 4 is a higher number than 3, therefore maybe better. But not such a thing. This is just based on risk damage to the eyeball. It has nothing to do with therapy. Let's move on to look at the risks. What can cause tissue damage with lasers? And a little bit about the why. And then we look at, how do we protect ourselves from that, okay? So, what damages tissue is the absorbed energy density, period. Nothing to do. I noticed some doctors just join us. And ED doesn't mean for erectile dysfunction. It means energy density, which is the dose, just in case. So you're in the right webinar. Wavelengths drive the tissue absorbency. So because of that, we have to focus again, wavelengths comes back again. We need to understand that a little bit more because wavelengths drives how tissues absorb the laser and therefore could affect the risk factor on damaging tissue. Wavelengths and peak power drive the tissue penetration. So there you can see kind of putting it together in the end. So energy density or dose and power density are the risk factors, not power and energy by themselves. It is not. Power is just the rate of photons per second, and energy is the total amount of laser delivered. Doesn't tell you anything about the intensity used. It's the intensity that can hurt, and that will be part of the dose or the power density. So we have to take into account, from the risk factors, we need to take into account the spot size and the treatment time. Those are the enabling factors that will make power and energy, whether useful or damaging, ablative. So let's look at the wavelength absorbency to understand that. So I have a chart here, the relative absorption on the vertical axis and wavelengths on the horizontal axis. I just used from 600 to about 1100, which is the therapeutic window. Those are the wavelengths that we use in therapy. Below 600, that's the red domain. Those are red lasers, and so let's put the curve. The blue one is going to be water. So that curve tells you how water absorbs laser based as a function of wavelength. So at the beginning, 600, 700, very low absorption. But as you move up to about 950, 940, 980, and so 1,000 or so, gets quite high. And then comes down again. So it's not monotonically increasing and decreasing. It goes up and down. They're all like that. They all go up and down. There's nothing straight. So even though some people say longer wavelengths is better or not, there's nothing linear about that. The red one is going to be hemoglobin, and let's not focus on the green one. That's okay. Let's just focus on the two most important tissue components in the human body, water and hemoglobin in the blood. So let me overlay some typical lasers in the U.S. Here we have the 650, very common. That's red light. Red laser is 650. About 600 to about 700 tends to be red. But if you notice 650 is absorbed by hemoglobin quite a bit. And because of that, the penetration into tissue would be fairly poor. Why? Because we have a lot of blood right under the skin, the capillary bed. The capillary bed will absorb a lot of the hemoglobin. I'm not showing the curve for melanin, but melanin has a different curve also. And red is also absorbed by melanin. Another very popular wavelength is 810. Anything around 810, 830, and so on, they're about the same. Notice the absorption by hemoglobin and water is relatively low, so that's okay about that. Then the next one, another popular wavelength is 910, which is the superpulse. 650, 810 are continuous wave lasers. 910 is superpulse. But notice the absorption is relatively low also compared to the 810. The next very popular wavelength in the US is 980. Notice 980 is right smack on the peak of the water absorption. What it means is water absorbs that particular wavelength very well, relatively speaking to 910, 810, and 650. What it means is converts light into heat, because the conversion from light into heat requires absorption. So 980, that's what those 980 lasers, they do get hot. Then another popular wavelength is 1064. And again, the penetration is fairly well. The absorption by water is relatively low. There are advantages and disadvantages of different wavelengths. That's why some of the lasers combine multiple wavelengths into one laser. The different tissues have preferences for different wavelengths. But that's a separate discussion, a separate webinar. Point here is that absorption is high by blood on 650 and by water on 980. So let's look at the inverse of that. Because of those two things, they affect the tissue penetration. So let me just show a chart that shows tissue penetration by wavelength. 650 is low, relatively speaking. 810 is much deeper. 910 is very deep. 980 is lower because of the water absorption. And 1064 again is deeper. So this is kind of looking at the same data, but from the tissue penetration perspective. So the point is that if you can't reach it, you can't treat it. So we have to be able to penetrate tissue so we can reach the target tissue, whatever that is. Whether it's a disc herniation or some tear or something like that, or even brain tissue or spinal cord or what have you. Let's move on to the safeties. How do we protect ourselves, in particular the eye? What to look for in safety goggles? So there's a rating system. Wavelengths, you have to check the range of protection. That's the first thing you have to look at. Because if you're using a laser says 810 nanometer, you must have goggles that cover the 810 nanometer range, wavelengths. Otherwise, you're not being protected. When you look at goggles, they will give you ranges based on wavelengths. For example, these are just examples. One company may say, well, our goggles are covered from 720 to 1090 nanometers. So 810 is covered, 910 is covered, 650 is not, right? 1064 is covered. So it looks like it's a good one. Covers all the near infrared, common lasers for therapy used in the U.S. Another example, notice it has multiple ranges. Very common goggle. Most of them will have multiple ranges. So you have to look at it carefully. This covers the 190 to 534 and then skips 730 to 1064 and adds one more by itself, 10,600. So 190 to 534, that's the UV, and that's the very short wavelengths. They're not on the therapy side, those are surgical lasers. 730 to 1064, that's a good range for the infrared, for therapy. And 10,600, that's a surgical laser. So that's So this covers multiple ranges. So this goggle more likely will be much more expensive than the first one. Okay. The second factor, there are two factors: wavelengths, make sure you're protected, and the second piece is the optical density and the visible light transmitted, the VLT. Okay. Optical density tells you the level of protection. Okay, it's the level of protection. It goes from 0 to 10. Well, 0 means no protection, right? It's really 1 to 10. So typical is 4, 5, 6. Those are the typical numbers. High protections means higher cost. Lower protections tend to be cheaper goggles. So that's kind of, you can imagine that what's happening there. The VLT, the visible light transmittance, also affects the cost of the goggles. That's the percentage of visible light, not infrared, visible light transmitted. Would be a percentage, called like 32%, 10%, 60%, whatever. As you can imagine, higher VLT means higher cost laser goggles. Now let me give some specific examples I got from the website. This is a company from England. This is a 125-pound pair of goggles. Notice how this is right straight from their website. Laser protective eyewear for, and that's how it reads, 720 to 1090 nanometer. Okay, so you can see whether you're covered or not. In my case, I use 810. Well, it doesn't cover the 650, so this may not be a good one for me because my lasers have 4 wavelengths. They have 650, 810, 910, and 1064. So this may not be a good one. But if it does cover, this is how you read it. Notice the next level says optical density. Optical density depends on the range. It's not all even. It's a good optical density of 7. That's high protection. That's good. But only at 1064. Because of the range of 730 to 1090, the optical density is 5. Not bad, but it's less than 7. So that's how you read these numbers. 4 is coming from the low end. I wouldn't go lower than 4. 4 is coming from 720 to 1090, so overlaps with the optical density of 5. And then the last piece is the VLT. VLT is at the bottom. In this case, it's a transmittance of 34%. The VLT, because it's visible light, not infrared, visible light is what allows you to see what you're treating. Okay, so you want a high percentage. So you as a doctor, you want to see what you're treating. So you want, 30% is not bad. That's a nice way to have 45, maybe 50%. But cost goes up because if you have high protection and high VLT both at the same time, that cost can go up. You can have a pair of goggles being $400, $500. Let's look at another example. This is the other one I showed you before, multiple ranges. It will show you that right on the website, laser protective eyewear, 190 to 534, 730 to 1064, and 10,600 by itself. And then have the optical density, again, different values, 7 for the low, the UV section, 6 for the 315 to 534, which therapy is not useful. But it's 5 for 730 to 740, just a short range. This one, that's a nice one. It has from 740 to 1064 is an optical density of 6. So that's good. But the VLT is only 11%. What it means is this is a dark safety goggle. 175 pounds. Well, see, the cost is getting there, even though the VLT is low. And the reason is a higher cost because of the protection ranges. It protects a lot of wavelengths, good optical density, low VLT, and so that's 175 pounds. But if you want the same protection, same optical density, and a VLT say of 40%, this price will more likely be 300 pounds, 350 pounds. The one we use here in the U.S. for our company, US Laser, we buy our safety goggles from a company in Michigan. They manufacture the laser goggles there. A company is called No IR, but for no infrared. Okay, That's a website up there. No, we have nothing to do with them. It's like they don't know that I'm talking about them here in this particular webinar. But it's a good company. And if you go to their website, you will see under laser shields, this is what it shows up on the screen. And when you put the mouse over the different colors, a window pops that tells you the optical density, the wavelength, and the VLT, all in a little window. So you can kind of scan to see, and the price at the bottom. That one is 160. I know you can't see it off copy. I'm going to blow it up. But at a glance, you can see the color of the lens, so what you like, and tells you the protection, the VLT, the wavelength, and the price all in one shot. So that's nice, just by putting them out in the window pops. But once you select one, I picked up one there, and then it gives you a little more details. The wavelength there, 765 to 1080, but the protection, the optical density is only 3. And that's a little, it's low. 4 should be minimum. Notice the next one says 780 to 855, and there's a gap, 950 to 1070. So already a 4, optical density 4. And then 785 and so on. You can see that. And on the right side, you can see the different frames. So you can see wrap around, take over, pediatric, or whether you want to wear it on top of your regular glasses and so on. So they have a large number of frames and all that. If you're a laser geek like I am, I want to know exactly the curves. Where's the VLT? Where does it peak? Where can I see the best? And where's my protection coming from? So there on the same website, you can also see the chart for each of these safety goggles. The way to read this chart is the blue curve is the protection. That tells you there it goes from 0 to this about 6 or so. And so that goes, it's protecting the low end and protecting on the high end. Okay. So of course, I'm interested in the laser therapy. I'm using near infrared, so it would be on 700 and above. So I'm looking at the right. I know you can't see those numbers, those little numbers. Okay, you can go to the website and see yourself. But the way to read the chart is you look at the wavelengths at the bottom on the horizontal axis, and that gives you the level of protection, how it goes up and down based on the wavelength. Okay, and in the center is the red dotted line. That is the VLT. In the center, why? Because that's from 400 to 700. That is the visible spectrum. That's what we see. For example, this will tell me that in the middle, where the highest point is around 650. That's nice. That's back right in the red one. So the highest VLT I get on this pair of goggles will be on 650. Otherwise, everything is around 4 or higher. So that's good. This will be a good pair of safety goggles for $160. It's not bad. All right, let's move on. How much laser image is too much? I know for some of you doctors that came in a little later, when I was presenting the initial agenda, I mentioned that this bullet is a loaded question. It actually is it's asked fairly commonly, but it's the wrong question. Okay, let's get into that. You should know the answer by now. See how much laser is too much. There's not such a thing. So can energy cause tissue damage? No, laser energy does not cause tissue damage directly. If the energy should not be used as a main laser factor. This is many doctors, they're fixated. How many juice am I putting on? Wait a minute, so it's not the juice, it's the dose. The dose is the most important parameter, not energy. It's the laser energy density that can cause tissue damage. The dose is the one that you need to monitor. Not energy, not power. Since energy density is the power density times the treatment time, then PD indirectly can cause tissue damage, but that depends on the treatment time and the spot size. So we have to focus on those two things. It's not just one number. Unfortunately, we all want a silver bullet, right? One factor and that's it. That doesn't exist in lasers. There's multiple factors that need to be taken into account at the same time. unfortunately. So it's not so quick table and that's it. No, not such a thing. We have to think through. So energy doesn't cause the damage, it's how it is used. So let's go into the FDA and state regulations. We have two bodies that we have to work with. FDA, let's talk about that, the clearance versus the approval. Quite significant. The FDA uses what's called the 510K clearance process to clear medical devices like therapy lasers. So that's, you will see on the websites, on marketing brochures and all that, is a 510K cleared laser device. Okay, that's what it means. That means the FDA has allowed this laser to be sold in the U.S. So they're the gatekeepers on what laser can be sold or not. The FDA also approves devices, but the approval is much, much more complicated and much more difficult. Fortunately for therapeutic lasers, that is not necessary. But the FDA approval process called the PMA. That stands for pre-market authorization. That's just a jargon, the word PMA. That's it. The message here is PMA is different than 510K. There are two things to look at. 510K applies to laser therapy. PMA applies to surgical lasers and other more significant high-risk machines. Unfortunately, companies use the word approval casually because it sounds better than cleared. So, but it is illegal to claim FDA approved if a laser has been cleared by the FDA, even though it is used. In fact, let me show you one. I just got it 2 days ago from the website. This is from the website, the FAQs. The number of questions, but one was, is MLS laser therapy approved by the FDA? So I picked up, wait a minute, let's see what they say. The answer was, yes, the FDA has approved the use of MLS laser therapy, and there's also patent by the U.S. Patent Office. Well, can you spot the two issues here? This is splitting hairs. Well, kind of, but words have power, and here, even though besides being illegal, it presents the wrong impression, really. One key element, notices MLS laser therapy is approved. First of all, the FDA never approves therapies. The agency is called CDRH, stands for Center for Devices and Radiological Health. It doesn't say therapy, it says devices. The FDA approves and clears devices only, not how it's used. So to say that the FDA is approving a therapy, that's kind of pushing the envelope way too much, really. No, the FDA does not approve therapies of any kind, period. So in this case, the proper answer would have been the FDA has cleared the MLS laser, not the therapy, the laser only. But that's not here yet. So that's, I got it from the Cutting Edge website 2 days ago. So who regulates the use of lasers? The FDA does not regulate the use of lasers. Only the state can do that. That's a clear distinction. The FDA is the gatekeeper, but they don't regulate who can use it and how to do it. So that's why they don't get involved in therapies, only on the device itself. For example, an MD can use a Lumix laser to treat a bone fracture, but with the same laser, a chiropractor cannot do it. Wait a minute, what's going on? It's the same laser. Why not? The reason is very simple. The specific application of a laser must fall within the scope of practice, which is exclusively regulated by the state boards. So that's the main reason why who can use it and what they can do with the laser is regulated by the different states. The different states have different regulations. So what applies in one state doesn't necessarily apply in other states. So you have to be careful. Same thing on who can use it. In some states, well, in most states now, physical therapy can use the lasers. But years back, that was not the case. Now, that is the case now. Same thing with this. In some states, a nurse can use a laser. In some states, the answer is no. And so we have to check in the different states. Point here is that the practice of of laser therapy is regulated by the state, not by the federal government, not by the FDA. Some people talk about, oh, what's the difference between continuous wave pulse and superpulsed lasers? We have both kinds, so we don't have an axe to grind. There's a time and a place for both of them. And in our lasers, we have ones with superpulse only, or other ones with combined with superpulse and CW. So there's a time and a place for both of them, and the combination. That's a summary. Let's take it back to the clinic. Take-home messages. Okay, energy must be absorbed to cause damage. So the absorption is key here. Wavelengths drives the tissue absorbency. So we have to think about what wavelengths I'm using with my laser and what kind of tissues I'm applying it on. And that risk factor is affected by that. So I showed you a chart before. For example, if you use an 810, and you have a lot of water vascular tissue, then the risk is much lower than using a 980 nanometer, because 980 is absorbed much more by water, so it will get hotter, and therefore the risk of damage is higher on 980 versus 810 and so on. Its energy density could cause tissue damage, which, of course, because it's energy density that depends on the spot size and the treatment time. The word density is associated with spot size. You can think of the intensity issue. And because it's energy, that's involved with treatment time. So that's the connection between the two. So that is the dose. Peak power and wavelengths drive the tissue penetration. It's not the average power, it's the peak power. That's interesting. Some companies claim that, we have a 30-watt average power, so therefore it's going to penetrate deeper. Not quite. Average power drives something else. It's not the penetration. Check the rating and appropriate wavelength range on your laser safety goggles. We discussed before the range of the wavelengths, the optical density, and the transmission, the visible transmission. It's really more for convenience. The way we do it here, what I recommend is that for the doctor to have a high VLT, because you need to see what you're doing. But for the patient, you can have a low VLT. Patients don't need to see through, so you can have dark goggles, will be less expensive for you. Only the state can dictate how laser can be used on patients, period. It's black and white. The FDA is the laser device gatekeeper at the national level. They control what lasers can be marketed in the U.S. or not. So you have to check that it's FDA cleared before you purchase a laser. And like we discussed before, it's illegal to claim FDA approved when the device has been only cleared, but companies do it. Some recommended resources. We have a number of webinars all throughout the year. Check out our website, and for future webinars, I recommend the website by the North American Association for Laser Therapy. So that's NOLT.org. And WOLT, that would be the analogous, the World Association for Laser Therapy. Those two websites are the key sources of very good information, actually. In terms of book, I recommend this particular book, Laser Phototherapy, by Lars Hode and Jen Tuner. There's Lars Hode in the picture on the right side. He owns a laser company too. It's Iradia from Sweden. He's a Swedish guy. The Iradia is a superpulsed laser also. We met in a conference. He said, what are you doing with working with the competitor? Well, it's not, yes, it's a separate company, but we're barely scratching the surface about the potential lasers in the markets. So even though we're two separate companies, the opportunity area and what needs to be done with lasers is so vast that we're barely scratching the surface. I recommend the scientific basis of integrative health in this particular book. I wrote chapter 10 here that deals with lasers, of course. That's what I do. But here's the integration. Talk about integrative health. So that's kind of the nice thing about it, talking about lasers and other technologies and therapies in one book. And that's what we have is 11:50, almost, yeah, 11:48. I wanted to see if you have any questions in your window. You must have some um, questions in there. And excuse me. All right. So one question is, can we laser a wrist fracture through a cast? Well, cast will be opaque. Laser is light. Like any form of light, it needs a transparent medium to go through. So you can think of it like a flashlight. Can you use a flashlight to go through a cast? Well, the answer is no. Well, same thing for a laser. It's just a different form of light. So because the cast is opaque, then the answer would be no on that. So you have to kind of somehow drill a little hole or something uh, to be able to maybe put a little fiber or something like that. Are any of the lasers that your company produces portable? Yes, it's well, okay, it depends how we define portable, between luggable and portable. Let me just answer that real quick. It's more of a, not really dealing with safety, but that's okay. Yes, we have a very portable lasers called the laser call handheld unit, but the downside, it has to be plugged in. It is not battery operated. If by portable you mean battery operated, no, we don't. We don't have any battery operated lasers. They all need to be plugged in. And the reason was very simple. Once you put the battery in the laser call, the battery made it bigger and heavier, and less practical to be, then ceases to be portable. So we decided to have just plugged in. So there, it is small, handheld, but it needs to be plugged in. If doctors in the house call, that's another question. Oh, okay, well, that's an interesting question. If doctor is on the house call, any restrictions on laser use? So the doctor that owns the laser, now he or she is not in his or her office, right? So it's in the house call. The doctor can behave and do whatever they normally do in the clinic. Just because they're out of the office, that doesn't mean they cannot do something. Because what they do is regulated by the state. As long as they're within the state lines, they're okay. For example, if somebody has Virginia, licensed professional in the state of Virginia can do whatever they're allowed to do anywhere in the state. But if they go to say to North Carolina, they better have a license in North Carolina or Maryland or whatever. Okay, and yeah, many doctors have multiple licenses in multiple states. But yeah, that would be the answer would be yes. It can do whatever they do within the state lines. Let's see what else is in there in terms of safety. That's interesting. Question about the distance. At what distance you can see a laser and be safe? And that's called the DNRO. It's an acronym. It's French actually. If you look at the goggles and so on, the lasers, it would say some of them would say the acronym DNRO and a number. Okay, distance. Normally it would be meters because everything's in metric when it comes to lasers. And for example, our laser, a Lumix 2, our Lumix 2, the DNRO is 1 meter, so about 3 feet. What it means is that about 3 feet or more, or longer than that, I can look at the laser directly without goggles, and it's okay. Okay. What it means is it fans out enough, so the intensity went down, so it doesn't hurt the damage. It's all based on the intensity. Okay. So that's what it is. And more powerful lasers, of course, we have a longer DNRO. So we have to watch on that one. For example, a 980 nanometer will say 15 watt power. That DNRO is probably about 3 meters or so. That's about 9 feet, 10 feet. Because it's, at that level, yes, the concentration is high, even though the distance is longer. So that's kind of we have to be careful on that. Let's see what else is coming up. That's probably about it. Just checking my questions. All right, so we have 2 minutes left. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. Do check our website for future webinars. We have that every so often with different subjects. If you're interested in a specific subject, send us an email. We want to have education materials for either emailing, webinars, what have you. So we want to disseminate information for correct use and safe use of the lasers in the U.S. We have a long way to go. There's so many things we can do with lasers that we're just at the beginning. We're basically in diapers. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be in touch with you later on in future webinars. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.